Welcome to People, Places, Planet Pod, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization working to ensure a healthy environment, prosperous economies, and vibrant communities founded on the rule of law.
Welcome to this week's episode of the People, Places, Planet podcast series. My name is Heather Ludke, and I'm a research associate here at the Environmental Law Institute. The Environmental Law Institute has partnered with Sidley Austin LLP to launch a new podcast series entitled The Enforcement Angle. Through the year-long series, our goal is to discuss state and federal enforcement of environmental laws and regulations with senior enforcement officials and thought leaders on environmental enforcement in the United States and globally. The host of the series is Justin Savage. Justin is a partner and the global co-leader of the environmental practice at Sidley Austin LLP. On today's episode, Justin speaks with Jessica Taylor, who is the director of the U.S. EPA Criminal Investigation Division, or CID, and Doug Parker, who previously served as the CID director from 2012 and 2016, and now serves as a principal at RPO Strategies.
Thanks, Heather. Justin, Doug, how are you?
Doing well, Justin. Good to be with you.
Yes, happy to be here.
So before we talk about CID, starting with Jess, just tell us about where you grew up or anything else you'd like to share about yourself.
Sure. I really grew up all over. My father worked for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, so we moved frequently, always returning to headquarters in Washington, D.C. Went to school mostly locally at the College of William Mary down in Williamsburg, and then started a career in federal law enforcement at age 24. So I'm married to an active duty Air Force pilot, and we have 2 sons.
Doug?
Grew up in Connecticut and worked coming out of college, went to school up in Maine, and after that, I was a history teacher and a lacrosse coach for 3 years before I moved down to DC, and then joined the EPA at around 25, and then transitioned to CID, married as well. We have 3 kids and moved around a little bit with CID, but currently here in the DC area.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned family. I mean, I think if you're in law enforcement, they're part of it, and there can be some long nights, but I think I have a sense of this from Jess, but maybe starting with you since your dad was in the ATF, just walk me through how you got into law enforcement and then your career progressing up to director, and then we'll turn it over to Doug after you're done, Jess.
I think, in our family, service and responsibility, they were just core, right, in what we did. Growing up, we were all taught to carry our own weight, right, both literally and figuratively. Public servants, we would usually take our vacations, would be backpacking or hiking, usually in the Shenandoah Mountains, sometimes to more exotic locations, but certainly as a family of 6, we were all taught to literally carry our own weight, right? And so I think that was my first introduction to kind of how am I contributing, right, in both large and small ways. So, I ultimately pursued a degree in public policy. Law enforcement for me I think I was really looking for something tangible, for me to both protect and serve and contribute. Initially, I learned the ropes as a Secret Service agent for the first part of my career. And then transitioned and went into management at the Department of Agriculture, Office of Inspector General, which was really this unique combination of federal law enforcement and protecting natural resources, right? It's this unique field that I think so few people have the kind of ability to do. So it really linked me to kind of the environmental crime work I'm doing now at EPA's Criminal Investigation Division. Doug?
Thanks, Jess. I sort of stumbled into my career as a special agent at EPA. I was down here in grad school, also studying public policy. Got a job in the summer working in EPA's budget division, which helped pay the bills, so I didn't have to paint houses for my 11th summer in a row. And then from there, I had a real interest in law enforcement. I came from a background where service was also important. My dad was a minister, and my mom worked in education. So I felt that, ultimately law enforcement is an extension of that. And I began to apply to other federal agencies for special agent positions. And then about the same time, EPA started ramping up its criminal program after the Pollution Prosecution Act. And so I was kind of at the right place at the right time. I was already in the agency. I knew a little something about the environment, but it was my first foray into law enforcement. So I moved from a budget analyst to a fledgling special agent, and then spent the next 24 years at CID. And I've found it incredibly gratifying. Not every day was perfect, but there were a ton of good days. And I think I was really drawn to it because I like to think I'm mission driven, and the folks in the broader agency and as well as CID really carry that same ethic. So it was a great run for me, and I'm glad I stumbled into it.
Well, Doug, I'm sure you missed the excitement of being a budget analyst. It had to be terribly boring to be in CID as an agent in comparison.
You know, I said to myself, I felt like I was doing more for the environment when I brought my recycling out to the curb. And there are really smart people in that space, but it wasn't for me. I needed a score at the end of the day, the week, the month. I mean, it comes from, playing sports and coaching, and ultimately, you get measured and you have results in law enforcement, and that's what really appealed to me.
Yeah, and this discussion segues into, I think, a broader one just about what is CID and its mission, and just starting with you. For people who aren't familiar with CID, just tell us about it and its mission.
So CID is EPA's law enforcement, criminal enforcement arm. We focus on criminal conduct threatening people's health and the environment. So there's a larger kind of office that we're a part of. I manage and supervise the special agents and analysts dedicated to criminal investigations, but we also have some incredibly talented criminal enforcement attorneys and our forensics lab out in Denver. A lot of folks wouldn't know this, but EPA special agents are fully authorized law enforcement officers empowered to enforce environmental laws as well as federal law in accordance with the guidelines established by the AG. Federal government, a lot of people refers to series. So the series is called an 1811. It's the same series used by FBI, Secret Service, different office inspector generals. And I just I'll toss it to Doug next, but I think what I've found here, right, coming up on 5 years, is just the diversity and the perspective of background. And I know Doug, I'm sure, remembers this. I think what really separates us is we have former attorneys, former scientists, former engineers, former law enforcement. I think when you have a more homogenous type of environment, you can produce results, right? But I think the totality of the folks we have here at CID really allows us to accomplish amazing things.
Yeah, I agree. I wish I thought of that and said that earlier, Jess. So that's spot on. And I think when I started, it was kind of a bucket of former military and law enforcement, folks with some environmental background, which I guess I had, and then kind of true scientists. But it's a great great mix of people, and I think that we're only CID, the former we, is only successful because of the three-legged stool that Jess mentioned. Incredible attorneys, incredible technical support, and subject matter experts, and that's really the foundation. Agents are one part of it, and sometimes agents think they're more of it than they should be, but it's totally that three-legged stool that makes it successful.
Doug, it's once CID, always CID. Okay.
That's right. Absolutely.
I mean, sticking with you, Doug, a little bit. You're in the private sector now, and just starting with you, and then turn over to Jess. What do you see from the other side now, or some of the biggest mistakes or misconceptions that folks make in the private sector about CID?
So I guess I'd put it in a couple of buckets. On the one hand, I've seen individuals and companies who don't take, early interactions with CID seriously. They kind of confuse it with the inspection process, et cetera. So and CID is not well known, even in a lot of elements of the regulated community. And so I have seen folks who have, kind of not taken interactions with CID, which means they're probably under investigation, as seriously initially as they should. On the other hand, I think that it's important to know that CID is, I characterize it as kind of a welterweight that punches above its weight. It is not an enormous organization with tremendous resources. It does things by working really hard, scrapping, finding experts where they can. So it is not this over-resourced behemoth. But at the same time, they bring a real sophistication to what they do. In my view, they take on the most complex investigations out there. Not necessarily always the most important. I don't want to confuse those terms, but the most complex. And so it's really important, if you have that interaction and engagement, to really take it seriously. And I think some folks don't, and that can be a mistake. On the other hand, some folks certainly do, and that's the appropriate course. And then I think, frankly, from CID, I'll give a perspective on the outside that there are times that agents and staff don't understand the power that they bring in their work. Conducting an interview, knocking on the door of a company, et cetera, can send shudders down companies' spines. And there's tremendous power, and it's always important to wield that effectively. And I think the agency and CID has, but they carry tremendous weight.
Jess, do you want to add anything to that, or?
Yeah, I actually spot on. I agree with everything Doug said. I loved his comment, right, about our size, right, and we hit at, and I think a common theme for our folks is that you're just not going to outwork us, right? We're grinding it out, and I think that was important in what Doug just said. Yeah, and I think that the clarification, you have many different tools at EPA, and we're one of those tools. And I think a lot of folks confuse who's doing what, and that's important at the outset. So I thought that was a good delineation that Doug made.
And sticking with you, Jess, and then maybe going to Doug, just, Doug mentioned knock and talks, other things that CID does as they're conducting an investigation. What does CID look at, Jess, or the factors when they're considering whether to open an investigation?
So, case opening, right, is kind of a significant moment, and we get tips and leads from everywhere, right? Citizens, local law enforcement, regulated entities. And for us, it's the two big factors, right? It's significant environmental harm and culpable conduct, right? Those are the two biggies. There are always a variety of factors at case opening that you're looking at. Those lead us, those guide us. The threat of harm, actual harm, repeat offenders, violators, deliberate misconduct. I think those are really the things we're looking at as part of our function as that tool, that criminal enforcement tool. Certainly we work very closely with our civil counterparts at EPA, but those are the two main factors.
Anything you want to add, Doug? Or
I think she hit it. So I'll leave it with the current director.
And sticking with you for a moment, Doug, and then we'll go back to Jess. Sometimes you'll see a CID investigation that begins at a company and starts looking at individuals. Why does, just from your prior vantage point, and then let's hear Jess's perspective, why does CID investigate individuals for folks who aren't familiar with the division?
So, deterrence, in a word. You deter future conduct by holding individuals accountable for wrongdoing, much more so than companies. And so there is a intense focus on finding if there are individuals who are culpable for criminal conduct. 40 plus years ago when CID started, I think it was, 80% of the defendants were companies or corporate organizations, and 20% or fewer were individuals. Most recent statistics I've seen are that's flipped on its head. 80+% are individuals, 20% are companies. And there's a place for, certainly corporate accountability. But if you can drive that accountability to individuals, the view is that's absolutely the greatest deterrence. And that's what you want to do, not just in environmental law enforcement, but obviously in other fields of law enforcement.
Jess, you want to add anything to that?
Completely agree with Doug. I mean, spot on. the acts, I mean, we get this question a lot, frankly, and it's just the acts of an organization are committed by people, right? It's individuals who are the decision makers, right? A brick and mortar building can't decide to do a criminal act. So exactly what Doug said, I totally agree. And, criminal sanctions are some of the strongest deterrents to future behavior that I can think of.
And sticking with you, Jess, just let us, talk about the role, if any, that whistleblowers can play in a CID investigation.
Yeah, they can be critical. They can be critical to any potential investigation. They're often on the inside, obviously, and reveal relevant potential criminal conduct. And I think their kind of sense of justice and integrity is often what leads them to us or to any law enforcement organization. About half of our initial, what we call leads, right, when we're taking a look at something before it becomes a case, about half of those come from tips from external parties. So yeah, I think they're essential with the information they bring forward. And I think it's messaging, right, and letting them know who to contact, and then being aware when wrongdoing is committed. There's also whistleblower protections, so individuals can come forward without fear of reprisal. So I think it's ensuring that folks know those protections, that companies do that.
Yeah, I'd agree. Some folks can make a career off the right whistleblowers. There's obviously a subcategory of disgruntled employees within there who sometimes find religion after they've been shown the pink slip, but they too can be critical.
And sticking with you, Doug, you've got the perspective as a longtime person inside of CID and a leader, and now in the private sector. So starting with you and then maybe getting Jess's perspective, what do you see as some of the most common issues with compliance programs that might lead to criminal conduct or an investigation?
So I think there's a couple of areas. One is prioritizing operations, production, and even capital expenditures over compliance. And compliance can be viewed as a secondary focus. And oftentimes, companies get in trouble when they lose sight of the compliance as a primary focus. So I think that is certainly one. And I think also ongoing repetitive violations. When conduct continues and it's been addressed from an administrative standpoint and a civil, and it continues, that's oftentimes where CID or other criminal investigators can come in. So keeping compliance at the forefront and understanding that repetitive violations are certainly going to be a signal of interest potentially to the criminal program. And then foundationally, it's truth. False and misleading conduct is the biggest driver of criminal investigations and prosecutions, at least in my experience. And so ensuring that ethic and that focus is driven throughout an organization, to me, is really critical in staying away from my former colleagues in a criminal investigation.
Any other thoughts, Jess?
Yeah, as Doug was talking, I wrote down truth, so it was perfect. We're on the same wavelength here. Obviously I'm on the public side, but I think the culture of any organization is very important and can dictate and guide decision making related to compliance programs for their employees. They have a responsibility. You have a responsibility to communicate and ensure compliance with your programs clearly and effectively. And I think once we get involved, Doug touched on this, telling the truth and being honest is paramount, right? And I think that's ultimately what we're looking for, is just, companies really beating that into the brains of their employees, right? Honesty, telling the truth. And that's really going to ultimately strengthen your compliance program.
And let's stay with you, Jess, for a moment and get your perspective, your official perspective, and then maybe Doug can offer his too. But this is not a dance CID does by itself. You ultimately have to refer a case to the Justice Department. That can include ECS at ENRD, U.S. Attorney's offices, and just at a high level, walk us through how that relationship works as you're pursuing a case.
Yeah, so I often say what we lack in numbers or resources, and I think what's really positive with the current administration is we're now being asked what we need, right? So I think there's a really positive, strong future ahead of us here in CID. Really, the name of the game in this job is partnerships. It's relationships. So you really have to build those relationships with your allies. Really, we work with across the 94 judicial districts in the U.S. Attorney's Office. We have key partnerships specifically at what we call Main Justice, right? The Department of Justice Environmental Crime Section. For us, I think what kind of differentiates maybe civil from criminal is we investigate, right? And really we include the Department of Justice at the earliest possible stage. We definitely need their expertise. And I think the key is just communication and discussion. So we coordinate very closely with them at the earliest possible moment.
Doug, anything to add there?
No, but beyond the fact that I learned early that you've got to bring DOJ on at the outset, as early as possible to be successful. These are big, complex cases. Ultimately, the prosecutors are the ones who have to potentially sell a case to a jury, convince a judge. And so that early partnership is really critical. You don't walk in and dump the case file and say, here's the completed investigation. That will not work in these cases. So early and often engagement with DOJ is really critical.
And Jess mentioned the administration, and let me direct this question to her. Last month, June 21st, Larry Starfield, who's the acting assistant administrator for a week, issued a memo entitled Strengthening Environmental Justice Through Criminal Enforcement. Jess, can you just give us, explain what this memo does? Does it change your day-to-day approach, or what people should really take away from it?
So the memo really does three things. First, it strengthens the detection of crimes in overburdened communities. Second, it aims to improve outreach to crime victims, which is vitally important. And third, it works to enhance remedies sought in environmental crimes cases. To the second part of your question, how has the memo changed the day-to-day? Environmental justice has always been a factor, right, for criminal enforcement program, but certainly as a priority for the current administration. We're looking at new ways to engage and communicate with environmental justice communities and ultimately secure justice. That's what we're there to do. So this memo came out recently. We're doing a lot of stuff in CID to kind of think outside the box and how we can contribute in EJ communities.
And Doug, just from the outside, do you have anything you want to add to that memo?
Well, I would say what I would add is that CID's been engaged in this, work for decades. So it's a great reaffirmation of, what they're doing, encouragement, but importantly, the work that CID does often involves communities that are impacted by illegal pollution, and sometimes that involves criminal conduct. So to me, it's really important, and again, it's kind of a encouragement for the work that CID has been deeply involved in, really since the outset of it being established.
And Jess, turning back to you, climate change has certainly been a priority for this administration. It seems like it's in the news every day. As a component of EPA, does CID have a role in addressing climate change?
I think so. I think, the role is certainly different, right, than those of the program offices and the rule makers. But, we do enforce those federal laws that are in place to protect human health and the environment. I think, talking about priorities and the current administration, we are working currently with a push to set up a couple different task forces with critical federal partners, just in order to force multiply. We know what the priorities are, right? And now we have to kind of provide the strongest efforts possible to support this administration's focus in combating climate change.
And Doug, switching topics a little bit, but maybe not so much, I'm going to ask you about something near and dear to your heart, and then ask Jess to weigh in. But does big data factor into criminal investigations, whatever big data means?
Yes, near and dear to my heart, and it should, and I think it increasingly will. Kind of pivoting back to your question to Jess about climate, the government under this administration is taking this whole of government approach, and CID is not, as Jess pointed out, the regulators or the program offices or the subject matter experts. But if you look at some of the reporting requirements, you look at the greenhouse gas reporting data. Is that data accurate? Is it legitimate? Is it authentic? That's an area where big data, climate, and potentially CID can evaluate whether companies are being truthful in their reporting. So I think that type of thinking, applying kind of data and analysis, is really critical. I think 10 plus years ago, we started what I would characterize as a small data effort related to fraud in the renewable fuels market, looking at what information the agency had, submissions, analysis, et cetera. And that continues to be a really important initiative and bring criminals to justice. Jess had a press release recently of I think $100 million plus matter. And so I think big data is huge. I think if there's any investment, if I were to go back, in my tenure and I could advocate for, it would be more analytical support to take on data, because that's what's driving much of the economy and much of the compliance world at this point.
Yeah, you raised several interesting points, and Jess did as well. And I'm going to, see if there's a topic here where we could discuss a little bit more. But it's not uncommon to see in a criminal investigation the FBI or other agencies. I mean, like a postal inspector even. Do you think with this emphasis on climate change, all of government, and big data, and without getting into any specific investigations, do you think it's going to be more likely that you'll see other agencies you partner with in this space, whether it's climate change or other issues you're trying to tackle?
I do. I think, as administrations come and go, right, you have kind of certain agencies that have a primary role, right, and who pop up. And I think when you don't, you want to find your niche, right? What is my role here? How can I play? How can I get into this game? How can my agency contribute to the current priorities? Big data, Doug hit the nail on the head, is essential, right? Not only for evidentiary purposes, factual purposes. The amount of digital evidence seized during our environmental investigations has increased significantly, right? So it's not only kind of data in what we're looking at evidentiary-wise, but it's the review of this data. And I think, to Doug's point, we are doing that right now, right? That's one of our priorities. It's analytical assistance, and it's requesting assistance. We have a great function down in Jacksonville. It's called the National Computer Forensics Lab, where we really just have some creative and talented folks looking to provide case agents the most effective mechanisms for reviewing the seized data, right? So you talk about different agencies. I think the Department of Justice, we rely heavily on them, right, and their tools related to big data and evidence review. So yeah, Justin, to your point, I think certainly folks are going to look, okay, how can I engage here, right? How can I be a part of this effort?
And on a related front, I don't know, we could stick with you, Jess, but it seems like these days, because of COVID, there's lots of discussion of global supply chains with manufacturing, distribution, and importation of goods occurring across the globe. What challenges do you face in CID if you're going to have to investigate potential crimes that may occur across the globe?
And every federal investigation, right, especially a complex one, are always challenging. The degrees of complexity are immense. I think criminals will certainly go to great lengths to avoid getting caught. Internationally, right, adds a whole nother component for us. Right now, training and detection is huge, right? If folks at the border and folks that are importing don't know what to look for, then it's very challenging for us to get those leads that we need to look at criminal investigations. So it really is training and detection with our partners at Customs Border Patrol and Homeland Security Investigations. I will say that DOJ's environmental crime section has been an amazing, immense asset for EPA CID when it comes to international and global investigations. They just have a lot of the conduits into just a wealth of countries, and they've just been immense with their connections at Interpol as well. You probably saw, or maybe you didn't, we did a significant push into COVID fraud when the pandemic arose, and a lot of that came from overseas. There was a strong overseas component. So Certainly, it makes it very challenging. And again, it's the strength of our partnerships and certainly our relationship with DOJ.
Yeah, I would agree with Jess. It's all about partnerships. If you've got those connections, relationships with the larger agencies that have that international reach, then you can be successful in those instances, and especially as supply chains extend and the issues, compliance issues extend as well.
Yes, those investigations, Doug, they can stretch like the river at the English Gardens in Munich. Inside joke. And this is really, I'll start with Jess and get some historical perspective from Doug. But someone at our shop, Nicole, who's much smarter and younger than me, had an interesting question about how is fraud tackled in environmental credit markets. I mean, RFS, this is the typical example. But then is there some thought that that type of fraud, those type of fraud cases could extend to people who falsely claim they're providing EJ benefits? So it's an interesting question. Wonder if, starting with Jess, if you had any thoughts on that.
We're certainly prepared to apply what we've learned in our RINs fraud work to other areas, I think, as they arise federally. As you've likely seen, the lengthy sentences associated with RINs fraud defendants should make it clear to folks that there will be a steep price to pay when it comes to fraud in any type of credit markets. Doug, under his leadership, right, he kind of was at the forefront of this, and I would love to hear what he has to say about it. As regards fraud and EPA benefits, specifically, I'd expect the Office of Inspector General will be eager to tackle that aspect from the fraud, waste, and abuse perspective.
Doug?
Yeah, I think, the key to looking at these fraud issues that impact the environment is really, looking at them from both, what's changing in the economy, because that's going to drive behavior. What's changed in regulations, or are there changes in regulations? And then what's the data to support and help identify that fraud? So that's years ago where we kind of started with RFS, and the agency's been running with it for, a solid decade. But as you look at things like, climate offsets, there's all kinds of opportunities for potential fraud in this space. But to me, it's really starting with, where's the economy going? Because that drives incentives. Are there regulations changed that are inadvertently or unintentionally opening the door for misconduct? And then what's the universe of data out there that you can help gain a picture of it before it hopefully gets out of control?
Thanks, Doug. And I always try to end with this question. I think it's my favorite question in these discussions, and I think it's vitally important just for our country. But I'll start with Jess. I mean, you mentioned your dad was in the ATF, your husband's in the Air Force, you're serving. But unfortunately, polls show that there's really a significant drop in interest in public service among the younger folks. So starting with you and then turning it over to Doug, what would you say, Jess, just to encourage younger people to serve, whether that's at EPA, another agency, the military, or some other fashion?
I think it's perspective. I just think the perspective you gain from a job in public service is vital, and it can be at the smallest levels, right? I really think everyone should try as part of their career. And we've seen folks, it's not like it used to be, right? We stay in the same career for 30, 40 years. I mean, people are jumping to where they find work that's valuable and meaningful to them. And I think that experience and serving as a public servant at some point, whether it's local, city, state, is just so important. For me personally, Doug kind of talked about this, right? It's the tangible result, right? It's kind of seeing something at the end of the day or the end of the week or the end of a year. And I think you can accomplish that with the federal government, the military, wherever you decide to serve. But truthfully, really, I think we need good, driven, experienced people who work with integrity in all areas, right? That means private sector, that means public sector. So I do think I would encourage everyone to get an experience, however small or short, working in the public sector.
Yeah, and I would just add that, I grew up playing sports, being on teams, coaching, and I enjoyed that, camaraderie, that mission-based focus, and really doing something that was, living beyond yourself for a purpose. And you can do that in a lot of ways, but you can certainly do that in the occupations that Jess and I have been involved in for many years. And I think it's hard to get that in other venues sometimes, but that mission-based focus is really, for me, was very meaningful, and I had a lot of fun. As Jess knows well, there are days that aren't fun because of some of the things that she has to deal with, but overwhelmingly, it was an enjoyable career, and I worked with really team-oriented, good quality people who I learned from like literally every week. So I hope people will consider it. Because the government, law enforcement, we need good people.
Thanks, Doug, and thank you, Jess. And I know you're both extremely busy, so thank you so much for providing your insights and time to our listeners. Have a great day.
Thank you. It was wonderful. Appreciate the invite.
Likewise. Appreciate being with you.
Thank you for tuning in to People, Places, Planet Pod, brought to you by the Environmental Law Institute. We would like to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and ideas to podcast@eli.org. And if you're interested in learning more about our work, attending one of our events, reading our publications, or becoming a member, please visit our website at www.eli.org.